So thank you all for your patience, and welcome to this panel, which is online media and collaborative learning. One of the welcome changes to our normally, I feel like research-heavy AHA. It's great to have people who want to talk about teaching and what works in the classroom. My name is Molly Warsh. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh, where I'm also the associate director of the World History Center. And I'm very grateful to Madalina, my colleague from Pitt, who put together this panel, and to all of our panelists for coming today, and for you all for being here. We will try to keep our presentations short, 12 minutes max, because we really want to have a lot of audience participation and hear your feedback and hear about what works for you. So I will be a strict task mistress with our speakers. And our first speaker today is Frederik Vermote, not Vermont, as he says his student calls him, who is an assistant professor of world and Asian history at Fresno State University. He is a research fellow at the University of San Francisco Ricci Institute for Chinese Western Cultural History. And before teaching at Fresno State, he finished a postdoctoral research project at the National University of Singapore entitled Empire in Asia, A New Global History. His most recent publications include Travelers Lost and Redirected, Jesuit Networks and the Limits of European Exploration in Asia in Itinerario, as well as various chapters on Jesuit finances in Oxford and Brill edited volumes, and an article in the World History Connected Journal from a forum in which he examines methods for teaching world history using student-centered interactive games in undergraduate survey courses. Vermote's book manuscript, titled Moving Money and Missionaries in a Global World, The Jesuit Financial Networks Between Europe and Asia, is under contract with Brill. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. My name is Fred, and in my 12-minute presentation, I hope to do three things. First of all, introduce you to my teaching environment at Fresno State. Second of all, my pedagogic problem. How do I encourage collaborative learning in my class? How do I make my students improve their writing, critical reading, and historical research skills in a collaborative manner? And thirdly, the technological solution that works for me, which is the Google Drive platform with Google Docs, Google Slides, Google Hangout, and all the rest of it. I'll sort of talk about the steps of the research project in my class. And finally, sort of lessons learned by evaluating my students and giving them a long questionnaire on like whether or not this was valuable to them. Did the collaborative learning actually work? So, first of all, I teach at Fresno State. We're one of 23 campuses of California State University. I think we're like in fourth position with 25,000 students. We are rather diverse. I think we teach 48% of our students are Hispanic, 21% white, 13% Asian in Fresno, that's mostly Hmong. 8% unknown, 6% non-resident, 3% African-American. I believe up to 66% of our students are first-generation students. So Fresno is in the Central Valley of California between LA and San Francisco. We have a lot of industrial agriculture, and a lot of our students are the first generation in their families to actually go to university. I feel that this affects what we do in class quite significantly, what type of learner they are. I am the World Asia person. I teach a 4-4 load. My classes are capped at 43 and 28 students. I teach mostly World History 1 and World History 2, big survey courses for non-history majors, and occasionally sort of an Asian history course, which most students, they've never ever taken Asian history. It may as well be history of Mars to them, so I start from scratch, in essence. 28 or 43 students is too big for an interactive class exercise, so I have to start jumbling with groups, group work, and then sort of an interactive situation to make sure that all of them are actually participating. So that's sort of my teaching environment, so to speak. Now, I've always cared about pedagogy more than I care about technology. In fact, my nickname, my high school yearbook nickname of 98 or so was the man who cannot put on his computer. Because the first technology class that I attended, I couldn't figure out how to turn on the computer. But the button was all the way in the back. It was really inconvenient, let's put it this way. Anyway, so I guess I'm not the right person. I mean, I've done multiple technology workshops, and I've done them always for the wrong reasons. Free iPads, but there's only so many iPads one can collect. You know, I've got kids, so I give them iPads and stuff. And sort of free money with few deliverables. So I never really found a technology thing that really worked, and I never really bothered to try too hard until I stumbled upon a major sort of situation, a pedagogic problem whereby my students can't write. They don't know the difference between their, they are, and their possessive. And this was really frustrating because I want to make them better writers, better readers, and the way that I wanted to do that is by making them write the way that I write, which is basically multiple drafts, rewrite it, editing, and then back. The problem is that I have 4 classes of possibly 40 students, and I can't edit that many papers multiple times in a term. It's just too much work. Plus, it drives me nuts. So what I wanted to do is for them to edit each other. So I needed a platform where they had all access to sort of each other's work and where they would start to edit each other's work. And I would give them, for example, a list saying, these are the 12 mistakes I never ever want to read in a paper again. Because initially they don't know how to edit, obviously. So the technological solution to my problem was Google Drive. And I sort of adapted it most recently for one of my fall 2017 classes called History 191, which is sort of when Asia was the world and the world changed Asia. It's an upper division history class. It had like 13 seniors, 10 juniors, and 3 sophomores, 26 students in total. Luckily, I have a Google or a Gmail email address, and all my students, institutionally, their institutional email address is also Gmail. So what I did in the first class is I sent them an invite to a folder. So basically, this folder, History 191, all my classes are there, as you can see. And I invited them all doing this. And I simply copy-pasted all their email addresses in here, boom, invite, and they all had access. They were all able to view and edit whatever I put up in this Google Drive folder. And I put up the syllabus. I sort of included all readings, things that I scanned for them. I included all the PowerPoints, because I'm sick and tired of using PowerPoints and lecturing. I wanted them to be the drivers of their own education, of sort of their own research projects. But some of them still like PowerPoints. I just dumped it all on there. And I sort of explained to them, what you're going to do now is you're going to do a research project. I'm going to completely integrate everything you do in this class. The first class you sign up for one of 7 sub-areas, I call them, that you should sort of, think about. For example, people of 2 worlds, silver, opium, tea, tobacco, pirates. They all signed up the first class, and then I said, okay, the first assignment I want you to do is I want you to write a précis, sort of a book review. In order to do that, I sort of created a thing called the draft précis folder, put every group in there, teamed them up with a writing buddy, and said, okay, here's what every paragraph of a précis looks like. So basically, we first talked about the first paragraph, the first sentence of a book review, almost always the same. You got to talk about the argument. What is an argument? And they started writing, and then depositing it in Google Drive. Their writing buddy could access it at any point, provide feedback to it, and I could see that feedback. If you sort of go into a random thing, then I could see who had changed the book review of one of my students and how they had changed it. So I could see that George, for example, gave a ton of feedback to Preston. And it went to a first draft, it went to a second draft. I made George present, not his own book review, but Preston's book review in class. And then only all the way at the end, I said, okay, now deposit your final précis, and now I will look at it. And that's in essence what I did throughout the entire class, starting with a sort of a duo, a one-on-one writing buddy, to expanding it to the entire group of like 3, 4, or 5 students in their research area. Sort of eventually I make them do read a research article together and sort of provide feedback on reading notes. I made them build a brief video presentation about somebody else's précis in their group, in their sub-area group. I made them do a primary source analysis, and all the way at the end, I made them write a paper, a research paper of 10 pages together. And I told them you can't copy-paste like particular things from your own stuff and then just patch it together. I will notice and I will punish you. So they truly had to collaborate within that group of like 3 to 5 students and then present on it together in class. Finally then, the data that I got out of, the final exam was actually a final assessment that I made them do, whereby I asked them, okay, so how did you like this learning process? What worked, what didn't work? Do you like the technology? Do you not like the technology? Do you find that the technology didn't contribute at all, etc.? And I got some funny stuff back that I'll sort of try and summarize in a couple of things. My first takeaway point is that I'm no longer a lecturer. I am a delegator, a supervisor. I do not control the content. I don't like that role a lot because it's tricky to let go of content, and sometimes they go in a direction that I don't want them to go in, but sometimes they come up with really good things. It worked for them, seemingly for me. The second thing is technology does not replace class time. I have a long commute, about 150 miles. If there was any way that I could not make that commute and just stay at home and surf, I would. But the technology doesn't do that. It doesn't work. Everything I make them do on Google Drive, I follow up with in-class stuff. That's just the way it works. So it's not less work. That's perhaps my third takeaway. It's more work and more sort of checking and seeing if they're actually doing what I want them to do, and keeping track of deadlines and all that sort of delegation work. They seem to like Google Drive. One of them wrote, "It felt like I lived on Google Drive." I'm like, oh, that's pretty intense. They sometimes actually help me. For example, the final assessment, I just made like a Word doc questionnaire, and one of the students got back to me and said, "Hey, you can use Google Forms for this." And I was like, "What?" "Yeah, I've heard of that, but I don't know how it works." And he said, "Well, actually, I already did the work." So I said, "Okay then, I guess I'm a learner too in this class." Sure, let's go for it, Alex. We'll put it up on the Google Drive, and you collect the data. And he did, and it worked, and I learned something. And I guess that's the true meaning of collaborative learning, I suppose. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Madalina, who received her PhD from the University of Pittsburgh. She is now a postdoctoral fellow in digital history at the American Philosophical Society, and also a visiting fellow at Temple University's Center for the Study of Force and Diplomacy. She is an historian of the Habsburg monarchy in a global context and is interested in the history of science in the early modern period, with a focus on cartography. She is currently working on her book manuscript entitled Foot Soldiers of Empire, Habsburg Cartographers in the Age of Enlightened Reform, which is based on her PhD dissertation, which she defended in 2015. Madalina's work has appeared in journals such as the Austrian History Yearbook and Itinerario, the International Journal on the History of European Expansion and Global Interaction, and is in many collected volumes dedicated to the history of cartography. Madalina.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming, and Ethan for actually being the organizer. I just got Molly to come, so that's my main contribution, I feel like. I know we're talking about technology in the classroom also on this panel, and sometimes I'm also having problems with technology like today, but we'll see how this goes. So I'm currently like a fellow at the American Philosophical Society, so I don't get to teach this year. But I did get to teach last year. So I worked as an adjunct instructor at 2 different places in the Philadelphia area, and most of the examples that I'm going to bring today are from like World Civ class that I taught at Widener University, but I also teach my European history classes with like a very strong focus on like global phenomena and development. So I always pay very close attention to that, so some of the examples will come from that. And one of my challenges as an instructor was that, first of all, I don't like textbooks too much. I know some students love them, but like I really find them kind of boring. So I really started relying a lot on primary sources, and I discovered that yes, primary sources like text-based are great, but as I know from my own work with maps, images are important too, and also like using videos. And then I started complementing the information from these primary source readers with like documentaries, with short videos in the classroom, with podcasts, and with music. Just because I like music, not because I'm a music historian, and it was like a fun challenge. So that's something that I worked on a lot last year in my work. And I'll start by I'll talk about podcasts, movies that I use in the classroom, like short clips, and also about music. So I'll start with a podcast. Like as you see, this is what we see all the time. Luckily not in this room now, because everybody's listening very carefully. But I kind of had this idea, even though I don't really listen a lot to podcasts on my phone, I thought other people must be doing this all the time. And why don't I try to use that in the classroom? Because, you know, students are more hip than I am, and they for sure do it. Now, I didn't go about it by like really looking for historical podcasts. Like I knew about a really good podcast on Ottoman history, and I tried to use that, and I'll tell you how it failed. But then I just asked like a couple of recent high school graduates, hey, what do you like to listen to? And they came up with things like the History Chicks, because it's a lot about women in history, or something with, I'm sure many of you know in this room, like stuff you missed in history class. And I started looking for stuff up there, and I was like, hey, this is not boring, seems pretty accurate from what I know as a historian, I'm just going to use that. So I'll give you some examples. For example, on the session on the transformation of Europe, Black Death and Renaissance, I used the podcast How the Black Death Worked. And I never used it podcast alone. Like I always combine them either with an additional reading or with like a discussion in the class or with another activity. Now in this case, I used it quite traditionally. I just had some questions for them at the beginning of the class, like what is the Black Death, when did it take place, things like that, which amazingly, they had all listened to it, I think, and they like came up with good answers based on the podcast, and then I made them read primary sources in the classroom, like very short excerpts from people that actually, you know, lived through those events and wrote something about it. And that really helped students contextualize those primary sources better, because they already like knew something about it. So that worked well. Now my next one of my other successful experiments was on a class on industrialization and modernization, where they listened to a podcast about the Luddites, which I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it well, they had no idea what it means, but they listened to this podcast, they enjoyed it, and then we did like a role-playing group activity in class. I'm really into doing like this sort of activities too. So I divided them into 2 groups, and based on the information from the podcast where they had learned about this conflict between Luddites and the police force in Nottingham, I divided them into the police force and the Luddites. And they had to answer various questions that would, you know, help us understand better the historical context. And of course, they drew that information from the podcast. So this was fun too. So then I got ambitious, and I said, well, I do cartography. There's this great book out there on mapping the Ottomans. Palmira Blume also did a podcast on this, like they did an interview with her. I'm going to assign this, they will love it. This was a total disaster. Like they came back by saying like, they have no idea what she talked about. They couldn't answer like simple homework questions about it. So that's when kind of my take-home message from all that was that even though maps are cool, and we should always talk about them, you should be very careful when you assign podcasts that they are really short. They're not like 45 minutes long, unless they're like, I don't know, like the best thing you've ever heard. And they should be really engaging and easy to listen, because like if they want to listen to it while they're on the metro or like, I don't know, exercising, that's how I imagine them doing it sometimes. They don't have the transcript in front of them, right? But you also should make sure that you have transcript available for them, and that's something that I feel like I've learned like at the AHA, at the session on podcast yesterday, and it's something I'm going to incorporate. Like make sure, you know, luckily all my students could hear and they could do that. And then just combine it with additional material. Don't rely only on the podcast, because obviously like they need help contextualizing that, so integrate it in your classroom activity. Okay, now I'm going to talk about some of the short clips I used in my class. I'm not going to talk about documentaries or historical movies that I also assign in my classes, but just like exactly how I use clips in the classroom. And these are like some of the resources I've used, like the History Channel, or of course the World History Crash Course, which can be like brilliant sometimes, or just like clips from documentaries like Égalité for All, or like I even showed them a short clip from the movie Germinal with a young Gérard Depardieu. So I showed them like this scene with like a mining collapsing to kind of make them understand some of the challenges miners were going through, right? So, okay, I'll show you some examples, some that worked and one that didn't, obviously. So when we talked about the world at war and life in a trench, I really wanted them to understand how was it being in a trench. And of course, I'm not into like historical reenactment. I couldn't do that with them. But I made them watch this brief clip, which I'm not going to run it for you now, but it kind of describes on history.com how life in a trench was, and you get the sounds and the music and the feeling. But then I also asked them to read pages from like a comic book, which is, I think it's a great comic book by Jacques Tardy, which really describes how war was in the trenches. And then we again read some other sources, like written sources, like by fragments from Remarque or from Fritz Kreisler. And then we discussed like that experience, how was it, what does that tell them about like changes that, you know, World War I brought. And also I asked them which media, in their opinion, transmits the experience of fighting in the trenches the best and why. And then we kind of talked about how different media can transmit different historical messages. And for me, I would have thought that they will all say, hey, video is the best. But they didn't say that. Some of them really like felt more connected with like the visual comic books, and others said, no, like video was too much for me, but like I like the written form, like I could really relate to, you know, the author better. So the other thing that I showed them, like, for example, when we talked about climate change, this is like the last session I do in world history, like kind of like our challenges. And this was in 2016, kind of December, just to put it in context. And I showed them this short clip on the history of climate change negotiations. How much time do I have left? 5 minutes. Maybe I'll show you this, because this is great, and I think we need a distraction. It's like an 80 seconds. I'll show you a little bit. If it works. Maybe it doesn't. Why doesn't it work? Okay, never mind that. Ideally, it would work, and it would be super funny. Come on. This really helped them review kind of like all the main steps that led to understand like what happened in Paris, you know, during the Paris Agreement. And it's just fun. Okay, but anyway, you get the idea. I'm going to try to go back from here if I can. There we go. It's really fun, and they really like got a good summary of it. So like I loved it, and I just found it by looking up on Google, you know, fun videos on climate change. But then they also read at home a document, like a nationwide petition about the people's ratification of the Kyoto Protocol. And then we also continued the discussion by talking about the Paris Agreement and why do they think that's important, and, you know, do they even care about this topic, why not? But the video is really what helped me kind of like get them interested in it. And then something that should have been a resounding success, and it was a disaster. This first interview with Mahatma Gandhi from 1941, which I was like, oh, this will be amazing. And then I played it for them. I'm not going to spend 2 minutes trying to get it working. And the quality is so horrible. Like, you can't hear anything. The image is really bad. You know that he's probably saying super meaningful, interesting stuff, but you don't know what it is. So everybody got so frustrated. So the way I got around it the second time I did it was to actually find the transcript online, make sure the transcript is correct, so they had the transcript in front of them, so they could still kind of like see Mahatma Gandhi giving an interview, but follow up, you know, what he's saying. So takeaways from this. Clips should be short if you use them in the classroom, I think, and I mean, I'm sure you're all aware of that. The equipment should work well, so like I would always be early in class, 15 minutes or something, test and make sure it's all working. If you use YouTube links, they change a lot, so make sure you update them. And give the students some questions before watching the video to kind of help them focus. Okay, what does she want out of that? And again, integrate the material with other sources or lecture slides, you know, so it kind of makes sense to them. So the last thing which I think this was the most challenging for me to integrate in the classroom was music. Because I had to do so much additional research in some cases to really not be like, hey, here's a cool piece of music from the 1960s. Okay, now let's talk about our class material. So I kind of wanted to go beyond that. These are a sample of some of the things I'm using, like La Marseillaise, the Marriage of Figaro, the Scorpions, the Plastic People of the Universe. Maybe you've heard about them. I had never heard until I prepped for this class, but that was cool. Or Beethoven Symphony No. 9 arranged by Mahler. And again, some things that worked, some things that didn't. When we did a discussion on the revolutions in the transatlantic world, and we talked about Haiti and the US and France, we listened together to La Marseillaise in the classroom, and it was kind of like, nice, and you know, like that type of feeling when you're listening to an anthem, obviously. And they, of course, I found the video with English subtitles so they could follow along, and then we talked about what are the main themes of the Marseillaise, how does it suggest the radicalization of the revolution, what type of music, what does it remind you of? And then we talked a lot about how the French Revolution went through a lot of transformation, so this being written in 1792 is very connected with that phase of like war and fighting the Austrians and all that. And then I kind of always ask them, is there any music that's meaningful to you or that you feel represents you? Why? And then we talk about that if they think that's cool enough and they feel like sharing. Okay, now another fun session we did was on the 1848 revolutions, and here, I mean, I'm originally from Romania, I'm from Transylvania, so I know a little bit better the historical context there. I gave them the lyrics of the National Song of Hungary, which was written in 1848 by Petőfi Sándor, but then we listened to a clip from 2010, and this you should totally check it out. I'm happy to share. This is like kind of this like hard rock metal group that's singing like this song, and it's amazing how many people they are in the audience and they're like singing along. So then we didn't only talk about this song in the context of like, oh, 1848, dying for our country, building of nation states, but we talked, okay, why is it popular now? What's going on in Hungary now? What's going on in Eastern Europe? So, and I'm sure you all know what's going on, just a little bit. So anyway, so we kind of connected like the past and the present. And then the last thing which didn't work was in my session in Search of Enlightenment, I thought, let's make them listen to Mozart and the Marriage of Figaro, and I selected a too long scene, and it just didn't work out. They didn't have the context, they didn't understand how it goes with Enlightenment and all that, and it just took too much time out of my lecture time and explanation to, really invest in that. So conclusions here, music, use it to break down the class and maintain their attention, make sure they have access to lyrics in English, translate if you need to, and again, the challenge part, the historical context for the piece, so it's not just like superficial integration. And that's it. Thank you.
Our third speaker is our panel's fearless organizer, Ethan Hawkley, who received his PhD from Northeastern University in 2014. He's now an assistant professor at Wesley College. He has taught Asian and world history courses at a variety of places, among them Northeastern, Macalester College, the University of Alabama in Huntsville, and now at Wesley. His research focuses on the convergence of the Islamic, East Asian, and Western worlds on the Philippines at the turn of the 17th century. And he says he really hopes the Celtics beat the Cavs 2 nights ago.
Which they did.
They did.
By the way. It was great.
Sneak down here.
Pull this up. Thank you all for coming today to our panel. Oh no, Fred, I'm losing it.
Yeah, sorry, my corners are hot.
Oh, I got it. All right. So thanks everyone for coming to our panel today. I hope you all leave with a lot of ideas about ways that you can be more collaborative and use technology in your classrooms. That's why I wanted to put together a panel like this. And kind of the way I came about this was a lot like Fred, where I just had some problems I was trying to solve, and I found some pretty simple technological solutions. I'm not really a tech person, but Google Docs makes things very easy sometimes. We'll kind of talk about 3 different ways of using Google Docs to make your classroom more collaborative in my talk, and a lot of this relates to what Fred said as well. And this can begin at the very beginning of your course as you're designing your course. And it sends a message to your students that this is a collaborative course at the design stage. And you can also get your students involved in creating content for the course and then evaluating themselves during the course. And all of this can be done with some pretty simple technology. Okay? And basically, kind of like Fred showed you, I like to use the sharing with others link. I use it a little differently than Fred. If you've ever been on Google Docs, then you can click on the kind of file and then hit share, and it'll bring up this thing where you can enter email addresses, but unlike Fred, my university doesn't use Gmail as a platform. So I push this button up here. If you see it says get a shareable link. Okay, when you push that, it gives you a link that anyone with that link can then go to that page. Okay, and then you can put that link onto whatever platform you might use for your school, be it Canvas or Blackboard, and then they can access that Google Doc from there. So you don't have to get other emails and coordinate that, because that's a nightmare to get everyone to have a Gmail address. Okay. So that's the basic technology that you need to use to do pretty much everything I'm going to talk about today. So first, if we're going to talk about designing a collaborative course, I'm going to show you kind of 2 examples here. And the first one is kind of a smaller upper division class, and then the second one is going to be a bigger lower division class, and how I make them more collaborative. So click on this real quick. It's going to take us into a Canvas course. Hopefully, yes. So the course I want to show you is called Silk, Spices, and Slaves, and it's about the birth of globalization. It's a super fun course. But when I showed up on the first day, I showed up with this schedule for my students, and it was, I got to get out of that. Okay, yeah, so I have the syllabus, obviously. It's a unique course because if you look up there, I've got grads and undergrads. Okay, so it's a combined graduate-undergraduate course, and this is part of why I developed this, is because I was trying to figure out how to do that well. And I have, these are the things everyone's reading, these are the things just the graduate students are reading, and then I have this line here, undergrad leaders and graduate leaders. Okay, and if you notice, my name is up here a whole bunch, Hawkley, because I'm going to demonstrate everything I'm going to ask them to do, but I have a whole lot of blank spaces down here. So in that first day, we're doing a lot of work filling in this schedule of who's going to lead the class when. Okay? You'll also notice up here that pretty much every other day there's blanks in the reading list. So what I did here, if you go to this class list, I have another Google Doc that has possibilities for books. Every student in my class had to write a book review, pretty standard assignment, or maybe more than 1 book review. And I told them to pick from these books, okay, and to put those picks on the days when they're leading the discussion, okay? So at the end of the day, the schedule I get looks like this for my students. So you can see here I've got it filled out with people's names all throughout the semester. They know that they're going to be teaching the course on that day, and after the first 2 weeks, I'm not leading almost any lectures or discussion for the rest of the semester. I've already taught them how to do it. I expect them to be able to do it, and I feel like students often will rise to my expectations, okay? During the course of the semester, obviously students aren't going to be perfect in what they present, and then it becomes my job to kind of clean up any messes or problems that are happening in the course. They present bad information, or if there's something that we do or don't really need to delve into too much, I can correct that through the course of the semester. And kind of like Fred said, I'm more of a referee at that point than I am really standing up and lecturing to people. So that's an upper division course. You can only do this with like a few students. I had 8 in this course, so if you had too many students, it would be really difficult to pull off. But I do want to show you examples of how you can get other larger courses to look more collaborative and to be more collaborative from the outset. So this is my World History 1 survey. If you look on this, again, I've just shared this onto my Canvas platform. If you look up there on kind of my columns, we've got the due dates. That's not really important. The thing I most want to point out here is that I've got this red and this yellow here with these objects in the Joan pot and the bird-shaped pestle. Okay, so in larger classes, I've got to divide them into different groups. Okay, so for this class, I have 6 groups, and I say, okay, these are each associated with a podcast. Groups 1, 3, and 5 are going to do red. Groups 2, 4, and 6 are always doing yellow. So odds do red, evens do yellow. And they know that throughout the semester. So at that point, I explain on the very first day, People who are doing the red one, you're going to show up with notes about the Joe and Pop podcast, and I'm going to pick people from those 3 groups, or groups are going to collaborate and create a lesson plan. They're going to teach part of the class, okay? So the red group, 1, 3, and 5 will teach, and then 2, 4, and 6 will teach. That way, half of the class is always getting new content, and my students have to try to be giving content to people who don't have it. Again, there's going to be messes and content. Anytime you give content over to the students, you're going to have to clean up some messes. But I'm more of a referee again than I am the person generating all the content. Okay, and they see that from the very outset. So I wanted to also show you a couple of these resources that I'm using here that I think are really helpful in getting students involved. One of these is associated with these objects. It's the History of the World in 100 Objects podcasts. It's on the BBC, so if you, we'll go on to this one in a minute. So we'll start with this, History of the World in 100 Objects. It's Neil McGregor, the curator of the British Museum. He found world history, did it in 100 objects. I don't use them all in my class because that's a ton of objects, but I selectively pick and choose. They're all available online. Just as a note, you may want to download the podcast and then upload it onto your platform because it uses flash drive, and I think Google and Flash or Google and Adobe are in a war, and so Google doesn't play it, and then your students pretend like they couldn't figure out how to turn it on. Anyway, just download it and upload it. It's a little bit easier. But these podcasts, the way I make them accountable is they have to come with notes. Like I said, they're going to be teaching the podcast. Okay? It's really important, I think, with any resource, and especially with videos and podcasts, that they be accountable. Otherwise, they're not going to do it. The other resource I use a lot of is I use Crash Course World History a lot. I used to use a really formal textbook, but I found they weren't doing the reading. So if they're not going to do the reading anyway, they might as well watch a video. Okay? And with this, they come in, and even though the Crash Course World History series isn't perfect, it allows us to start a conversation about these different topics in world history. They generally come in and they've taken a quiz before they come to class, and then we'll play a game. And I center the game questions around things I really want them to know. And I also take the chance during the game to elaborate on things that John Green left out of his Crash Course World History video. So if there's an important thing I want them to learn about Zheng He, for instance, that John Green didn't say, then I can say that. Any mistakes that I feel like John Green makes in his analysis are actually opportunities for me to correct his mistakes and talk about, how different we all have different historical interpretations and why they matter. Okay, so I don't shy away from, and I think it's a really great resource. There's not a ton of huge glaring mistakes in there, but I'm sure everyone will find things in their field. They're like, oh, I would correct this or that. The next thing I want to talk about is getting them involved in kind of the evaluation process, and also how we end up cleaning up a lot of this content. Okay, because like I said, students generating content is going to create messes. So in my class, I'm sure a lot of you teach with IDs. I do that as well, and I give them a format that we're going to put on a common review sheet. It's just right up there. They do the ID, who, when, where, what, why we care. Okay? And then for every ID, we spend some time in class reviewing that ID and putting it onto a group review sheet for the whole class. So I'll click on this and show you an example of my World History since 1500 review sheet. Okay? I've got the format up here. And then week 1, I do this, education is not about grades, it's about learning. Okay, anyway, this is the real kind of the IDs of history. Okay, these are things we're covering in that first week. So essentially, I will present the information, and then after it's presented at the end of the class, then I get up and I say, okay, guys, we need to put this into this order, and I'll say, who is Zheng He? And they'll give me from their notes, he's a Chinese eunuch admiral. I write that up here, and it goes up on the review sheet. And the link to this is up on Canvas, so it automatically updates. Okay, so they can always check it. And then he said, when is he? 15th century. Where is he? China or the Indian Ocean. And I put the what and why we care on different lines because these are going to be big things. Okay, who, when, where, you can do that in a couple of words. So I want those on the top. What, why we care become more like paragraphs or just quick notes for them. Okay, so this is a really helpful tool, not just for them for studying for the exam, but for me to use as we evaluate information together. Because this creates a common class memory that we can all draw from. Usually, my review sessions before I use this were more just like them asking questions, we leave, and it's really short. Now my review sessions deal with me giving them, for example, a short answer. I'll give them the essay question, for example. So here's an example of an essay question. During the early modern era, Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas became one interconnected world for the first time in history. Using specific examples, explain some ways this affected these 4 regions. Okay. That's a daunting question, right, for kids at 100 level. But when they have that review sheet, I can say, okay, guys, in class, we do this in class, say, I want you guys to look at the review sheet, find me every reference to Africa on the review sheet. And then they find them, and they categorize them. Now they categorize all 4 of those places, and then we can start talking about what's happening in these places. So review day really becomes kind of a culmination of my unit, instead of just what's on the exam. And I help them to write that essay, and they're interested because it's going to be the essay. It also gives me, I've assigned them to make short answer questions before, where I say I want some content and analysis, find me something from the review sheet, or multiple choice questions. I have them come in with multiple choice questions, and they are motivated to do that because if I pick their question, it's on the exam. And so it's like extra credit for them, basically. So that's one thing we do. Another thing I like to do with them is create kind of rubrics and get them involved in that. And there are really 3 ways of doing that. One is, I'll just show you these examples really quickly here. Kind of the most basic stage of doing that gets them talking about the assignment is we'll pull up a Google Doc, and I will have written all of this stuff for my book review, like what's an argument, thesis, summary, analysis, organization, grammar. But I'll leave off these percentages, and I'll put them in groups and say, okay, guys, figure out what the percentages should be. And then they talk in the groups about what percentages be, what matters in a paper. Then they come to a consensus in their group. We talk as a whole about what the percentages should be. I put the percentages in there that they've said, and they've talked about the assignment. We've talked about the assignment. They know what matters in a book review, and I know that they know. Okay? Helps them to know what my expectations are. Another level of doing this kind of thing is if we create categories. This one, I'd given them the assignment, and I said, what makes a good teaching demonstration? And I had them kind of make a list and then categorize those lists into different categories. Okay, we just put all the words up on a board that are here in front of you right now. And then I said, okay, in your groups, put these words into 3 categories so I can grade you. And they put them into those categories. So again, it's them kind of building an evaluative apparatus. And ultimately, I think this is a really effective way of teaching because I love this quote from William Glasser. If you look at this quote, he says, 10% of what we read, 20% of what we hear. The most important thing, the best way to learn is by teaching and by getting my students involved in as much of the teaching process that I can delegate to them. I believe they're learning a lot more content as well as skills that I have that they need. So thank you for your time.
And our final speaker of the day is Kenneth Mondschein, who received his PhD in 2010 from Fordham University with a dissertation about duration, timekeeping, university and society in late medieval Paris. He's currently a fellow at the Arthur F. Kinney Center for Renaissance Studies. And I was reflecting, looking at his CV, on how it is that we all learn how to teach. Some of us do that in cushier situations than others, and Ken has learned how to do the teaching that he does, working in a dizzying array of institutions, teaching incredibly heavy teaching loads, which I know many of us do. But in his case, there are too many schools for me to even list: Anna Maria College, Goodwin College, Westfield State University, American International College, Springfield College, and many others. And in addition to teaching many courses per semester in all of these institutions, he is also a master fencer and teaches fencing. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what his classroom strategies are. Thank you.
So let me ask you all, please, to get up. And I am going to, not you guys, you're good. But you guys, if you could just move closer to me and just rotate these chairs so that they're facing inwards, because I'm kind of breaking the fourth wall for this. And Molly, can I ask you to advance the slide, please? Okay, and just turn the chairs in. Ordinarily, I'd have you circle it up, and if you could just briefly read your handouts for a second. Fred and since we've already done that, and if you can all just have a seat again, closer in. So I want to change the geography of the classroom. Very often I think, or the geography I should say, of the conference room, because very often, and history conferences reflect this, we teach the way that we learn. We're all excellent history students, I'm sure. And we were very happy to sit there and take notes. But much like Fred, I teach in schools, institutions where people are first-generation college students, and where they may not be so engaged, not so interested in the subject. So the first thing I do is I change the geography. Could you please advance the slide? So, and you all have a handout, if you can advance the slide again. So this, what I've given you, and you notice there are 2 different ones, 2 different colors, represents the reading that you would get online. It's taken from Paul Halsall's Internet Histories source books. And then the question then is, okay, we have the online reading. what do we do? How do we use this in class? And the first thing, I like to have a discussion-based class, and I like to involve my students in this. So instead of just me being behind, behind the lectern and explaining things, if you could advance the slides, then I like to involve people in a discussion-based classroom, involve them. So this is actually, comes from my fencing teaching, because of course fencing is hands-on. This is hands-on teaching. We learn 80% of what we experience. So what this is about Chinese technology. Oh, and by the way, you would have all handed in note cards about this for your homework. That's how I take attendance. So just from what you have, just give me some adjectives about Chinese technology and what Europeans thought about Chinese technology. Mm-hmm. Sorry? Technical? Okay. What did they think about it? So, okay, so technical. What else? Ingenious. Okay, ingenious. The Chinese were ingenious, and notice I'm writing it on a whiteboard. I'm giving my students ownership of what they're saying. What else? Someone from the pink side of the room.
Learned?
Sorry?
Learned?
Learned?
As the most learned in the world?
They were the most learned in the world. So they says they thought of themselves as the most learned in the world. Does the writer agree with that? No. So instead we could say maybe they're ignorant, right? Okay, so the Chinese are ignorant according to the pink sheet. What else? Give me some more adjectives. Unskilled. Okay. What else? Prideful. They're prideful. They're prideful, and they're all right. Good. And maybe just one more from the blue side. Simple. Okay. So it's simple. Right. So and then what I would have you do is actually trade sides. So the blue side can get the pink side. The one reading is, of course, from Matteo Ricci. And it's an evaluation of Chinese printing, and saying the Chinese came up with printing at a much earlier date than Europeans, and they have this wonderful, simple, ingenious system that is perfectly suited for producing a huge amount of written material. And I actually need to simplify the passages because often the reading comprehension level is a little difficult for my students. The other side is from Père de Halde, who is writing a history of the Jesuit missionaries in France. He never actually went to China, but he presents this big account of how the Chinese were these prideful but ignorant people, and how the Jesuits came and showed them something, right? Showed them some cool stuff, and this serves to authorize their mission. Could you advance the slide? So if you like, you can trade handouts, or just grab the pink one. It's got some extras. You see what you missed out on. So this technique, which I'm using, I'm sorry I've got my back to you guys, by the way. But this technique I'm using, actually, thank you. Yeah, sure. I borrowed it from my friend Nicole Lopez-Jansen, who is at Borough Manhattan Community College. And she said, give the students two different sources. Everyone doesn't do the same thing. But then, you could do a report, but then engage the students. If you could advance the slide again. Right? And then we'd ask, next thing, of course, now what do you think, right? Reading, and we could talk a lot about, well, where can we go from there? Advance the slide. I'll ask you, as history professors, where would you take this lesson now, if you had done this with your students? Yeah, respecting, Perspective. Right, perspective, authorship, right? One place to go. Any place else? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Who's right? Is there a right? Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Changing Western perspectives, right? Why was Matteo Ricci different, right? Matteo Ricci lived in China, learned Chinese, translated Confucius and a number of other authors. So there's a lot of places you can go. And of course, I'm using the technique now with, actually using it with you instead of just talking about Chinese history or the Jesuits in China, but actually where we can go with their pedagogy. So this entire idea of doing the learning outside the classroom and then doing it. It's called flipping the classroom. I have no idea where I stole the slide from. It was on Google. I should give someone credit, but I didn't. So the idea being, the thing is I found, if you could advance the slide again, this very often doesn't work. This entire idea of, here's my lectures, right? Here I record the material. But like Madalina was saying, you don't want to give people these long things to watch. They're not going to watch them. My students very often don't do their workout outside of class. They have a lot of other things in their life. Some of them are parents with kids. Some of them just, are just not academic high achievers. But very often that does not work. So what I tend to like to do is, first thing, I have to force them to read the things, which is why I do the attendance note cards. They have to read it and ask me one intelligent question on these, and that is your daily attendance. That's 25% of your course grade. So 25% of your course grade is ask me an intelligent question about what you read, right? And you say you guys would be like A through M, you guys would be M through Z for which group reads what, and I collect these and actually read them in class. So this is because you always have the shy students who are sitting in the back of the class. So this is one way that forces interaction with the material and make sure that they do it. But the other is to get the students talking to one another and discussing things, and especially relating things to their own lives. And this is one way that I can bring in diversity and shared experiences and different people's experiences into the classroom. What was, I can ask students, did people ever assume things about you because they thought they were better than you? Take personal lived experience and put that in the classroom. That's another way to engage students. 5 minutes? All right. The other thing, of course, is that we need to also account for multiple learning styles, right? This is a doing presentation here at the conference, and this is a doing style of pedagogy. Can you flip it again one more time? I think, yeah. So which is why instead of being behind a podium, I chose to do this kind of shtick that I'm doing here with handouts, with asking you, with involving you. And then, of course, I changed the geography of the room. And by changing the geography of the room, I changed our relationship. I am no longer a presenter, right? I've sort of formed us into a learning community. And it really, really does make a difference. Who circles their classroom? Anyone ever circle chairs in the classroom? Anyone? Try it. It's minority. Yeah, if I was saying you did before, try it. It makes a difference. If you don't do this, circle the chairs in your classroom. It may drive the custodians insane, but it works, as you can see from my doing it. And this is a show don't tell kind of thing. I think that may be the last slide. Oh, sorry. Remember always, again, tie the readings to clearly stated learning goals. Ethan was talking about that, right, with his IDs. To assessment, again, my note cards, but also Ethan was also talking about assessment. I mentioned connected to their lives, connected to current events. I was teaching the French Revolution. I connected to #MeToo. How do you, what is privilege? What is privilege? What were some of the complaints about the aristocracy? How did they lose legitimacy? How has Trump lost legitimacy? We already did the brainstorming, right? What can we connect this to? I'm sure you can think of of other things. And again, I'm involving you in this presentation, right? I'm asking you guys questions, which is what we need to do to our students. It needs to be a two-way conversation, even if you're not fully comfortable with giving over control of the classroom. And face it, that's scary, because Fred's nodding, and Ethan, you're way braver than I am, man. But even if you're not familiar with that, but you can this is sort of a middle ground where you can guide things. And then, of course, we can brainstorm if we liked how we could assess this, but I don't want to go over time. I think that is the last. 2 more? So the next one is my bibliography. Oh, that's just some background reading. I gave you a bibliography. And the last one says, please put the chairs back. So, thanks.
So thank you all for being fabulous, for giving us really thought-provoking discussions of your own teaching approaches, and also for being amazing at sticking to your time periods, which is fabulous, because now we can open up the floor to discussion. And I want to hear from everybody. I will just pose 2 questions sort of by way of getting us going, although I'm happy to abandon them. One is, I attended a panel at the World History Association conference last summer that really made me think, in which an instructor, a guy who teaches at a community college, talked a lot about how he has struggled to put into play collaborative learning techniques given the poverty that most of his students are in, and that he has had to really adjust his reliance on technology and make it entirely available through the university, because he cannot rely on students having access to the internet or computers outside of his classroom or university facilities. So I wanted to sort of raise that as an issue that we all may or may not encounter in our own classrooms, and how that complicates this discussion. And the other thought, and this makes me think of the genesis of this panel, is how different course material challenges us in terms of collaborative learning in different ways. And so for me, the biggest adjustment I've faced as a teacher is learning how to teach world history and world historical classes, huge spans of time and space. They pose a very different challenge for me than when I'm sort of swimming in the warm waters of the early Caribbean, about which I know a lot. I was trained as an early modernist. I know it so well, it's so much more contained. When I'm just working in 2 centuries in a time period that I'm really master, I feel like I can take many more risks as a teacher in that kind of classroom. Perhaps that just reflects the fact that I have only been away from my PhD for a certain number of years. Maybe these things change over time. But anyway, just thinking about how our teaching techniques change depending upon what we're teaching, what we're comfortable with, and also the issue of economic inequalities in our classroom, and how we adapt our teaching to confront and address those issues. And with that, I will open it up to the audience, and if no one has a burning question, I'll turn it back over to the panel. Yes, please.
Related to low income, the other question is students with disabilities. So, and then student familiarity with technology. So with the presumption, the older you are, the less versatile you might be, where in fact it could be the other way around, that older folks went to a class and they know how to do certain basic functions. Some students are just thrown Word or Excel is just thrown at them, and they actually haven't been trained. So related to low income, disability, and skill, how do you, to be able to use your strategies and yet accommodate these different demands?
Absolutely. Fred, you want to jump in on that?
Oh, yeah, totally. I had that problem, and I thought that I'd solved the problem because the Google stuff is all free, but I didn't. Because in my mind, when they did group work, I assumed that they would get together after class or something like that and sip some coffees and then together sort of on their computers work. And my students said like, no man, I have 3 jobs and I have kids and all of them have jobs. And they said like, this class time is when we get together. This is the time slot that I've squared away, that I'm not being bugged by kids or parents that I have to take care of, or all the other jobs that I have to do. So I realized that, now I realize that I have to, when I want them to do something together as a group, that's gonna happen in class time, because it's the only time that they are not working 60 hours a week or so. It's no longer, when I was doing my PhD, I also did a couple of kitchen work jobs, but that was mostly at night, and I worked for less than 20 hours a week. But my students now, they work for like 40 hours a week at least.
Yeah, same experience. I cannot ensure that my students have access to the internet or computers. They have other things, children, parents, criminal justice system issues even has happened. So I need to, that's one reason why the flipped classroom, it doesn't work, because that assumes a traditional college, and it assumes that somebody has certain privileges, and we can't assume that at certain schools. So that's why I try to keep my reading short, why I try to have most of the learning going on in the classroom.
Using the podcast, music, and your lessons, I approach it from a different angle. My undergraduate degree is in history. I have a master's in elementary education. I'm currently working on a master's in library information science. How do you get around the copyright issue?
I mean, with the podcasts and the videos? It's usually like, yeah, I'm just using whatever is like available online, or sometimes I I think I'm very privileged by hearing people talking here because the institutions I taught at had really great library resources. So like, for example, at Temple, there were some great documentaries that people usually have to pay for, but if they access it through the Temple University, they are free. But I also like to kind of add up to the prior question, what I found is like I make sure that the libraries have those materials available. Like for example, I use sometimes foreign movies in my European classes, and I made sure that the library had at least one copy. And if a student said, well, I don't have time to watch that, like I always try to find like some YouTube videos they can do, or we adjust the assignment. But what I found, and again, I have very limited experience compared to like my colleagues on the panel here, but what I found really worked well is just like being accessible to the students and having a good like relationship with them, and they came with me with different issues and we adjusted it. So like I had students, like you mentioned, podcasts that couldn't figure out how to work the technology, although I thought, hey, that's so obvious, you just click there. But then like, I asked them in the classroom also, did you have problems with this? And we had like a, you know, PowerPoint or like whatever there. I said, okay, let's demonstrate this. How would you do it? Or like, I would email them. So just like kind of being in constant communication with them, I think that helped me a lot dealing with these issues, yeah.
I'm struck by a thread running through all of these talks and the comments, which is that the phrase collaborative learning and sort of our emphasis on media and incorporating technology into the classroom, really there is still always this essential collaboration, which is between you as the instructor and your students. And you can achieve that collaboration in a variety of different ways. But it makes me think of what I feel like, and perhaps it's just me, was this moment of sort of frenzied excitement about MOOCs and that somehow all teaching was all of a sudden going to happen online. And certainly much of it does in many places. But I feel like that bubble sort of burst and there was a sort of recognition that you can employ many of these very sophisticated techniques, but really it's still, you need a mediator, and you need to be that mediator. You need to, in the phrase of Ethan, I think, clean up the mess sometimes and be in there to explain what it is that what's working or how it's being mismanaged. And so far I haven't seen a technology that really effectively gets rid of the instructor, the interpreter.
So if I can comment on that, they are getting rid of the instructor, or rather reducing the instructor's role. You do need that human aspect, but if you look at Southern New Hampshire State University or University of Phoenix, or near me, Bay Path American Women's College, you have these entrepreneurial online programs that have essentially packaged courses. They're bottled courses, and the instructor is reduced to basically a per-class employee, essentially an adjunct, but an online adjunct who's merely administering a course that's done by subject area experts. Because they found that MOOCs, there's no interaction, right? MOOCs failed for a reason. But it's almost like a scripted interaction that needs to be, that you do need that human touch, but there's that move towards assembly line education. And that is really our chief competitor in brick and mortar, maybe more at Fresno, but certainly at the sort of lower tier schools that concentrate on professional degrees where I've been teaching as well. That's really our chief competitor. I think what the saving grace is that students, what's keeping us from moving to an entire online model is the classroom experience, and that many people, especially older people, but many people in general, do learn better when they have this time. This is my time when no one is annoying me and I can go to class, and you can concentrate on that classroom experience.
One of the things that I've struggled with as I have been teaching different versions of world history, some of them really large, some of them smaller, some classes for 200 people, sometimes for 35, is obviously what we all face. What textbook do I use? Do I use a textbook? And one of the things that I have found really difficult about the times when I've assigned a major world history textbook is that it comes at a very hefty price with an immense amount of infrastructure, which the sort of publisher touts as, all of these bells and whistles that the textbook comes with, interactive maps and this and that, and you can put on your computer. It totally overwhelms me. Often I don't want to use all of that because in the end it's my class and I've designed it the way I want to do it, and many times I design my world history class around a theme of commodities or music or something, in ways that make whatever they've sort of hooked their textbook around not work for me. Even if I were to love it, every single aspect of it, which I rarely do, precisely this reason. And I mean, I teach at Pitt. It's a big state public school. I mean, I have the sort of typical range for a big state school of students, but I cannot force them to look at the sophisticated interactive maps about the Phoenicians. I cannot make them listen to the podcasts. A lot of that really expensive technology just sort of, I feel, goes to waste, so much so that I really increasingly tend to avoid it. And I'm just curious if other people have, because everything you guys talked about was very bespoke. It was very designed by you, knowing your students for your classrooms. And I wonder if there are any examples, either from the panelists or from the audience, of books or sort of kits that you have purchased and used in your classrooms that, rather than you developing new skills, learning how to use, you know, some particular aspect of the interwebs in a way that worked for you, but a case in which you actually bought something and that program, that world history textbook, or that whatever course book actually taught you something new and you thought, this fixed my class.
I have a response to that. In my world history surveys, I'm familiar with like the super expensive world history books. They're like up to $100, $120. So what I did 3 years ago is I told my students, if your book is in still an okay condition, I'll buy it from you. So I sacrificed all my professional development money that I wanted to spend on fun books, like downstairs in the basement. It was hard, and I bought like 15 copies of the same world history books, like Crossroads and Cultures, which unfortunately now is out of print. And all copies, those 15 copies, I put them in a library on 2-hour loans. And then I basically told my students, you should go to the library and read it, or you should definitely not copy it. and it solved, I think, to some extent the issue, because I know some students who went like, oh, okay, sure, I get it. And they didn't have to spend $100, or they spend it first and then sold it back to me for 80. So it tended to be, you know, less expensive.
I
Don't tell the editor.
I should do that, actually, because I don't use a textbook. One is I used to work for McGraw-Hill making textbooks, and I hate them. 2, I don't see why my students who are very often economically underprivileged, again, should pay $150 for a textbook, which they then are going to change next year so they can't sell it back, to increase shareholder value of McGraw-Hill or Macmillan or some other company. So it's, you know, partially a political thing, but also I use materials that are available online, and my PowerPoints, which are freely available. And, you know, they're probably not going to crack the textbook anyway, so can't make them read it. Oh, and I can't stand world history textbooks because, let me summarize all of them. And then the Chinese came up with this and that, and they made a wonderful and sophisticated advanced culture. And then the Mayans came up with this and that, and they had a wonderful and advanced and sophisticated culture, but they never raised interesting questions like the Needham thesis. Why did the West develop the scientific revolution and not China? And I'm interested in these questions.
So,
Sorry.
Oh, it's okay. So just to add to this discussion and to answer your question about how do we make them listen to the podcast. So first, like with the textbooks, I do similar techniques. I make sure that the library has copies. I actually don't assign textbooks anymore whenever possible. I just like scan stuff for them. Like it's a lot of work for me, like getting those primary sources in shape. There's stuff online available, but like, I mean, I'm from Romania and we never had to buy textbooks. So when I came to the US and I had to buy a textbook for the German class, I was like, I'm going to buy it, scan it and return it. So like, I already like had this sensitivity that it might be expensive to them, so I try to go around that. I have never found a kit like Molly suggested. If it exists out there and makes us all better or teach easier, that would be great, but I don't think it is. With the podcast, what I do, I incorporate them in my assignments, and I haven't talked about that, but they every week I have like kind of like weekly homeworks, and I make sure that in order for them to answer that question, they have at least to listen to the podcast or to watch the documentary or the historical movie. So I think that's the way to do it. But then with the shorter videos, because some of them, let's face it, don't have time to do that at home, we do a lot of discussion in class and we watch something there and we'll discuss it, or we listen to that 3-minute song, and then that's a chance for them to participate and get points very easily. So I try to do all these different techniques together, yeah.
Yeah, and I think too that one of the hard things about those kits is that it takes so much work for me to understand a kit. And if I'm going to put all that work into something, I might as well make something I want to do or that makes sense to me. Because when I'm building something, I can make it make sense to me. But when I'm doing a kit, I got to figure out what made sense to somebody else who And then it's like, it's just a lot more work.
One of the reasons that I was excited about this panel is that with many of my friends and colleagues, since I can remember, we always say, God, it would be so great if we could make the time to talk about teaching. And we rarely have that ability to sit down and say, what works for you, what works for me, let's pool our resources. And there's actually a fabulous project underway that came out of the sort of last meeting at the World History Association to create an online clearinghouse where basically involved parties will just warehouse. Anybody can write in and say, hey, this resource is fabulous for me, this one is fabulous for me. And it will be free, and anybody who wants to see, hey, maybe the World History Network has something that I can use for teaching whatever it is that you're teaching, and then access it. And for my money, that's probably going to be much more useful to me than buying a really expensive, massive infrastructure textbook plus X plus Y plus Z. Yes, you, sir.
Yeah, from my experience, it sounds like, and I've taught at different universities, world history, Chinese history, Japanese history, American, that what I began to think about was there came a point where I felt I had to be an entertainer in the classroom. And I'm also a Catholic priest and a preacher and do ministry. And sometimes I felt myself almost being in a triangle between someone who's an educator, someone who's teaching learning, someone who's an entertainer, sometimes even a stand-up comic, and then someone who's actually trying to persuade someone or do something. So I think there's a lot of different models that we're all wearing here, especially with technology, where we're learning sometimes as quickly as the people we're teaching. And I found that to be a real challenge that I had not anticipated in the last couple of years.
I had an amazing experience this summer at a pedagogy brief workshop at the National Humanities Center in the Research Triangle, where they brought in scholars from 12 fields in the humanities or something and paired university professors with educators from the K through 12 classroom. And I was paired with a woman who teaches world history in a 6th grade classroom in rural Virginia. And we spent 2 days. They gave us a lot of tasks, and I was struck by how much work they made us do in 2 days. I feel like in normal academia, you're sort of like, can you maybe get that to me within a year? And we're like, oh, a year. And this was like, you have 48 hours. We need a lesson plan. We need a podcast. We need a video clip of you talking about this lesson plan. We need a bibliography of resources. And you know what? We did it, and it was awesome. And this woman and I brought together because, and again, I think this really gets to the heart of some of the issues raised by this panel. We teach at very different kinds of institutions, many of us, and we have time for different kinds of things. Some of us feel a tremendous amount of research pressure. Others feel a lot of pressure just to teach the 6 classes or whatever it is that we're teaching every semester. We learn and develop stronger muscles depending on the parts of our lives that are demanding that from us. So this woman was amazing in the classroom. She was so much more sophisticated than I was at thinking about how to unpack a lesson about Luso-Japanese encounters in the 17th century. However, she didn't know any primary sources to work with that were not Western generated. Whereas I have a lot of time to do that. I was trained in the history of the Iberian empires in the early modern period. I know a lot of sources from the 17th century. So in our collaboration, I was like, hey, check out these 3 cool sources. And she was like, that's amazing. Watch me talk about it. This is how I'll introduce that to my 6th graders. And then we managed to put together this really cool, for lack of a better word, kit of resources that anyone can go to the National Humanities Center website and look up our little world history lesson thing. And a 15-item bibliography of resources. I knew some, she knew some. And it just made me really think about how important it is to talk across these divides, to talk across institutional differences, even just the K through 12 to university world. People know so much in all of these different spheres about how to teach and what works and what doesn't. And we develop them in response to our classrooms, in response to our students, in response to the pressures that we're under. But gosh, we would all just be so much better if we could put all of that knowledge in one pot and pick from it and see. And yet, the way the profession works, it's not that easy to do that. So then we end up doing things like buying $100 textbooks for lack of a better option, and then breaking copyright laws, or spending our own money to try to make these texts available to students who can't afford it. And it's an inefficiency that it would be so wonderful to solve over time if we could. Yeah.
I'm currently taking a graduate course on history of libraries. The professor, when she sent out the syllabus, said most librarians hate Wikipedia. We don't recommend it as a source for students.
Absolutely. That's fabulous. That's so cool. Yes, please.
And you talk about the textbooks and all the bells and whistles. I too have become alienated from using textbooks, and it's partially because as I've explored these kinds of approaches, less is more. And that's true in everything we do in all of our lives. In textbooks, it's all about the more. And the further I get from textbooks, the more I go back and I look at them and I think that they don't need to know this. It's going to get in the way of something else. So how much have you had to give up in pursuit of more? If I'm more interested in learning.
I think I could, so, I mean, I do just like 6 or 7 IDs a week, you know, which before I was doing a lot, you know, it was like they come, like the test, there's like 100 IDs on there, and I'm thinking I'm all smart, and I'm like, yeah, these kids, I'm gonna take them on this test, like 100, you know, they're gonna have to work real hard. But now it's like 6 or 7 a week, we have a test every 5 weeks, that's like 30 things. But we talk about those things, you know, and it's like, the educational process is so much better, and my relationship with my students is better. I'm not just like an entertainer up there, and I get good reviews if I'm a good entertainer and bad reviews if I'm a bad entertainer. I'm working with my students, and they're learning, and I think students really like to learn. Like, they really like it. And I think, as a teacher, I used to think, oh, they just hate learning, they hate working, but they like it when they're seeing progress, and so when I'm able to show them, break steps down to them and say, look, you're making progress, and look at how you understand this one thing. You can understand one thing. You can't understand everything, because I don't understand you know. When you try to teach them everything, they don't get anything. But if you try to teach them, you came away from this class with one thing. You understand that silver was really important to the global economy for these reasons, and it's linked to China, and you figure that out, they really feel like they learned something, and then they're just a lot happier. I think I have much better reviews for my students, and I have a better relationship with them. So I think you gain so much, like in the relationship, when you try to do less with content or worry less about the breadth of the world.
I have actually, to some extent, given up teaching them history. This may seem like a ridiculous statement, but I came to understand that my students are, you know, large part nursing students, early childhood, elementary education students, and they see it as a required, as a hurdle, and they don't see any relevance to their own lives. So what I tried to do is use the history content to teach them concepts, important concepts about, especially political science, anthropology ideas, like what is power, what is authority, what is legitimacy, how does this affect your life? I talked about the Me Too stuff, because, I mean, I would say the majority of my students are women, and connecting into their experience of the world, because, I mean, I'd say most women, if not all women, have experienced that sort of thing, and by connecting that to relatable experiences, and then say, okay, here's how this works in that society, I think I've had better learning outcomes, and students feel like they're learning more, and that because they're able to put words to their experience.
So what I ended up doing is, like I said, I just gave up on the textbook. So what I want them to read, in addition to listening to podcasts from time to time or watching documentaries or historical movies, is read primary sources. And I give them a choice. I mean, their choice is, you know, kind of like with toddlers. You give them 2 choices, and you hope that's enough. But like I give some choices, right? Like I say, you can read this or you can read that. So then they have some agency in that. But then in the classroom, we discuss both those sources, let's say, for that week. And I really spend more time on that, like actually like discussing those sources in depth, and that's what they are evaluated on also. And my job as an instructor, I feel, is like I can distill the key information from the textbooks, which I think is interesting. And I do confess, I do kind of like the kind of entertainer idea sometimes. I think I do enjoy doing that. So I try to make it as interesting as possible for them. But then we really focus on those primary sources. And I'm very tough in, like, if in my assignments, like midterms or final exams, if I don't see material from primary sources, like I let them have those on the table with them. Like, I'm not expecting them to memorize quotes, but I want to see material from them used in like a meaningful way. So that's kind of like what I'm really focusing on. Yeah.
That's funny. I gave up primary sources in my world history surveys, but like 1 week, I really want them to get nationalism.
Okay.
And I constructed this game where I put them in groups. They're each a nation. I put like this board on the whiteboard, and they have to get as fast as they can to the end of the board while rolling dice, and then sort of thinking about nationalism, like what's a cultural artifact that reinforces nationalism, and then one of them will say like, it's a flag. You know, and
Oh, that's cool, yeah. I like that idea.
because I want them to get that one idea, and then I use the textbook as like the thing where they can get information from.
Molly, can I ask a question actually from everybody? Because I kept thinking, like, is there something that you really wanted to hear about or you expected to hear about and you didn't hear? Or is there something that you could share? Like, I know some people have been sharing, but I actually, one reason, selfish reason that I wanted to be part of this roundtable was to get more ideas and more perspectives. So.
Yes, please.
So I'm kind of the opposite. I was in the college environment, and now I've gone to K through 12. I teach 11th grade U.S. history, and it's been a crash course in like how to teach, you know, because my training was not how to go teach, and now it's like teach, you know. It's very different, you know, and I found all of these amazing resources out there that, like you were talking about, how you meet the 6th grade teacher, and then all of a sudden she knows how to put it together in a way that students understand, but you have more sort of the experience when it comes to like sources and information. But there's a website called Teachers Pay Teachers, which is it's mostly K through 12, honestly, but there's some incredible like PowerPoints and all kinds of resources out there where you can just buy one thing, like somebody's PowerPoint on a specific subject, $3 or whatever, or you can buy like a whole course and then you just download it so you can choose whatever you want. The teachers are creating the material knowing that it's going to be given to maybe 30 students, maybe 5,000 students by the time you're done with it. You know, so there's not really that same copyright restriction that we were addressing earlier. But I find it really useful. But even though I'm teaching 11th grade, I don't use it either. I can't stand it. You know, so I'm using some of the collaborative learning things that you all were talking about. I'm lucky enough that I'm at a school with a one-to-one iPad initiative, so all the kids can do whatever it is I'm doing up there, especially on that teacher side. Sometimes they have their own component of it that they have at hand that they're working on. But anyway, it's a really useful tool. I mean, you may find nothing there, but I've purchased several things there. And if you make something yourself, I mean, ideally all the materials would be free, but you also can share materials on there and make them actually fun.
Many of the public broadcasting stations have programs that are tied in with the state standards, particularly in Georgia and in Florida. Teachers can go and say, okay, well, lesson on this standard, and through PBS Teach Scholar, they're able to go in and share videos, and you know, you can show students videos and then your activities that go along with that. So PBS is a great source.
Just to ask the room a question, who here has had formal pedagogical training?
I guess once in
Just curious.
I'll leave us with a cliffhanger question that I have been wrestling with, and I don't know how long it will take me to answer it, which is that on the one hand, we are in a world where increasingly, and I'm so aware of the generational divides in terms of comfort with technology, our students in general are exposed to a world of constant interaction with some kind of screen. There's this emphasis on everything has to have a technological component, and yet increasingly, at least at Pitt, more and more of my colleagues are borrowing technology from their classrooms. And so there's a tension between, on the one hand, this pressure that we feel as teachers to learn how to use online resources creatively, effectively, to have it increase and improve our pedagogy, and yet more and more we're also being told, no, students can't concentrate if you let them have a device in the classroom, you have to ban it. And I myself haven't yet taken that step. Many, many people I know have. I haven't taken it for the really basic reason that if someone told me that I couldn't take my notes on a computer, if I were a college kid, I'd probably drop the class because my penmanship is so bad. I would be that kind of teenager. So anyway, I don't know what the answer is to that tension, but I see it in our world all the time.
I don't know if anyone else has this experience. I had exactly the opposite.
How many people here bar them in their classrooms?
And I've been called a hypocrite for that, because I do use the.
I don't bar them per se, but I have a lot of nursing students. And if you want people who are excellent note takers and students, nursing students, and what they do almost universally in every school, they print out my PowerPoints and they take notes in the PowerPoints. And that's because that's, and I always say at the beginning of class, I put those PowerPoints up there for you, print them out. And the better students always do this. They print out the PowerPoints and they take notes because the actual act of writing fixes it in your memory. And the students who try to follow along online with the PowerPoints, it doesn't work. They check Facebook. I mean, you can't stop yourself. It's a built-in distractor.
And can I just quickly, because I know we're running out of time, and I'll send you that resource. I have this article which I found, which actually shows evidence that's not only distracting for the person that's doing it, but like everybody around them. So I include that in the syllabus, and I tell them this is why. But then like I'm always, I start tough, but then like if some student really needs their laptop to take notes, like we can talk about it. But there is this kind of self-awareness about it, like from the beginning, like, like trying to avoid distracting ourselves and others. So.
Absolutely.
I think that makes sense. Yeah.
Lots of food for thought. Thanks to the panelists. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.